like to say good evening to everyone. Truly, it is an honor and a privilege to be back in the house of the Lord yet again. Thankful for those who are here with us in the building and for those who are watching us on Facebook and YouTube Live. We thank you for your presence. And we always want to encourage everyone to come worship with us and study with us here at the building. We're located at 1630 24th Street North in the great city of Bessemer, Alabama, where our theme is Where Christ is King and Faith Works. We're going to start this evening Bible study with page 22 in our supplemental book, Not Made with Hands. Page 22, Not Made with Hands. Let us sing. Christ went a building to prepare, not made with hands, and 12 be decked with jewels rare, not made with hands. Well, I know, well, I have another building. I know, oh, not made with hands, and put on the armor of our God, not made with hands, and take the path our captain trod, not made with hands. Well, I know, I have another building. I know, not made with hands.
Let us pray. Our Father and our God, we are so thankful to come to your throne this evening. Thank you, Father, for your love, your kindness, your justice, your righteousness that you have bestowed upon mankind. We're thankful, Father, to be able to be servants in your kingdom. We're thankful, Father, that you allowed your Son to die to come to this cruel, shameful world to die for our sins, that we may have right to eternal life. And Father, we come this evening thanking you for the blessings to be able to hear another portion and to study from your word, that we may not only be hearers of it, but doers of it also. And Father, we ask you to just bless the manservant that's going to come before us this evening to break unto us a bread of life. Continue to be with him, guide him, give him a ready recollection of the things he's prepared and studied. And Father, be with this world that we live in. We pray for those that are in grieving tonight. We pray for those that are sick. We pray, Father, for the nations that are at war, praying for peace and pray for sustained peace. Father, we just ask you to be with us, guide us. Bless this congregation here at 24th Street North, on 24th Street in Bessemer. Just ask you to be with us, Father. Help us to be a light in this community. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Verse number 3. With shield of faith, defy the foe, not made with hands, until you hear the trumpet blow, not made when you have laid your armor down, I may with hand. Well, I know, I know, I know I have another building. I know, not made with hands. Good evening, good evening. We are continuing in our journey through the Old Testament as we take on the transition from the book of Judges into a new study, into the book of Ruth, actually in our textbooks on lesson 17, I believe it is, that it just picks up and covers the book of Ruth in a couple of sessions. And if you have your, well, actually, chapter 18, lesson 18 and 19 covers the book of Ruth in just a couple of sessions. Book of Ruth is only a 4-chapter book, very short, and some people have questioned its purpose for being in there, and I think it's a very valuable study. Could we come bring that volume down a little bit, please? It's echoing on me. All right. But as we look at the book of Ruth, we also want to kind of go back and take a look at where we've come in our studies and so forth with throughout the Old Testament and how it leads up to where we are today and where we've just finished up with the study through the book of Judges, and that being as we look at how God had planned and envisioned that redemption through the Bible come all the way from its very time. We basically have a couple of chapters of God's creation and perfection, and then man's sin, and then God's scheme of redemption that has been working ever since to bring man back to himself. And so when we take a look at that, we'll see that in Genesis we see the concept of God having brought on the scheme of redemption through that of the lineage of Abraham, and how that the promise of God through Abraham was that the world would be blessed because of him. And if we are to look at Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, we see a verse that we should be very familiar with, and that is that God in his promise to Abraham was that he would be the blessing to the entire world. And it says, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so Abraham is seen as the person who started the seed line, or through who God has started the seed line to come into bring the scheme of redemption to mankind through his lineage. We come on through and notice how that through Abraham, and certainly through his children, Isaac and Jacob, and then through Jacob's 12 children,
going down into Egypt and establishing a presence in Egypt. And then we find the book of Exodus introduces us to the idea of the salvation and the liberation of the children of Abraham and the formation of a nation of the children of Israel. And then we come on into Leviticus, and Leviticus introduces us to faith and fellowship with God through the priesthood and the system of a substitutional sacrifice process in which mankind is able to be guided under a group of laws that govern their society and helps them to walk in faith with God. Numbers shows us the nation moving toward the land of Canaan and an entire generation of people dying and leaving because of their unbelief and their lack of faith. And then we get into Joshua as the realization of faith and how that they began to get the inheritance. And we see the transition of leadership come along. And so that Moses leaves the scene and Joshua takes over and leads the children of Israel across the Jordan into the promised land so that they can inherit this land that has been promised to them for so many years. And then we get into Judges, where we've just been. And we see a situation in Judges where mankind or the nation of Israel has come to walk by sight and not by faith. They are living their lives the way they choose to live them. We see the devastating effect of the absence of godly leadership as a result of the warning that God had given through Moses in Deuteronomy. How that God there with Moses and in those sermons that he gave us in Deuteronomy, how he pointed out, standing between the two mountains, how that, if you do what God tells you to do, these will be the blessings that you will receive. If you do not do what God tells you to do, then these will be the curses that you'll receive. It is the book of Judges that shows us in living color exactly how those curses come to be. Because time and time again, we mentioned it as we were studying through there. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and men did what was right in their own eyes. Because of that, after the death of Joshua and after the death of the generation of those who lived during the time of Joshua, you find Israel just went off into left field. They just went and began to do whatever they wanted to do. They sinned against God. They disregarded his law. They just whatever it is that they wanted to do, that's what they did. And God, time and time again, sold them into slavery, left them there for several years, cursed them, just like Moses had told them in Deuteronomy. If you don't do what God tells you to do, all of these curses will come upon you. And you will not be able to enjoy the benefits in which God has given you. Through the promise of Moses of Abraham and his seed. Just a moment here. I'm having a fit with my tablet as it's trying to blink in and out on me. And so as we look through the book of Judges, we see that as we came to the conclusion on the last couple of sessions, talking about the horrible sin that took place and how that man had become so wicked, even the people of the nation realized that this was more wicked than anything they had ever seen before. And yet then we reflect back in our mind as we're looking at the devastated condition of the nation of Israel, and we reflect back in our mind Genesis chapter 12, where God had promised that it would be through the lineage of Abraham that he would bless the entire world. Where we are right now, where we have left Judges and studied through there, you might start thinking, well, has the purpose of God failed? Because after all, I'm talking about, it doesn't look like the nation of Israel at this time is a very good light to the heathen nations around them. Not when we are seeing where the Levite that was traveling, he didn't want to stop in a heathen nation to spend the night. He decided to go back to his own country and wind up the people of his country are more evil than anybody could imagine. With all the ugliness of sin, you might wonder, has the purpose of God failed? Take a look for just a moment at what Isaiah says about the purpose for God blessing the nation of Israel was. That's in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6 and 7. It said, I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness. I will also hold you, keep thee, and give thee, hold thy hand, and will keep thee, and give thee a covenant of the people for a light unto the Gentiles, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. The whole purpose for God in taking this small group of people down in Egypt and bringing them out and making them a nation and marching them into the Middle East, into Palestine, and giving them all this land was so that they could live in such a way under his rules and regulations so that he could bless them to such a degree that their lives would be so wonderful that all of the nations around them would say, there's no God like their God. And that they would actually want to be a part of the nation of Israel. And so all the time as we look through Leviticus and Numbers, how God is laying out all the rules, and he, in addition to him instructing the children of Israel, the Jewish people, well, they're actually not called Jews at this point, but the children of Israel, that how they are to live, he also put laws in there how they are to treat the sojourner in the land. And that is that God fully anticipated that there would be people from pagan nations that would be coming in to do business with them, to live around them, to enjoy the benefits that they were receiving because of God's blessings. Because that's what God intended to do. He intended to bless them because, after all, that was the promise he made Abraham, wasn't it? That in thee shall all the nations of the world be blessed. Now we know ultimately he was talking about the promised seed of Jesus coming into the world and truly blessing the world. But even that, with what Moses said to them in Deuteronomy, is that if you do what God tells you to do, he said, you can be blessed. You'll be blessed at home. You'll be blessed in the field. You'll be blessed anyway. He said your enemies won't even want to fight with you to get your land. He said you'll have more money. You'll never have to borrow from anybody. You'll be able to lend it to other people. All these blessings that came with it if they would only do what God wanted. And here Isaiah is pointing out, and of course Jesus quotes this as part of his purpose for coming to the world, what was that they were to be a light to the world. And if you really look at it, that's what the church is supposed to be, isn't it? We are supposed to be a group of people who operate under the laws of God, who God can bless, and because of the blessings that he pours upon us, we then allow that to pour out on other people, so that other people will see our lives as a testimony so that we can recommend the life with God. I think sometimes we miss the boat, don't we? Sometimes we act so miserable in our lives that other folks will look at us and say, well, if Jesus did that to you, I don't need him. And that's what we got when we come to the end of Judges. That's what we got. We got a nation that's supposed to be the light of the world that is so corrupt and so evil that if there is a light still burning, it's got to be flickering mighty dim. They're not showing the God that the Bible tells us we have. So that's why I think it's really important that as we end the book of Judges, that we rush right on into the book of Ruth. Because I think Ruth tells the other side of the story. Ruth shows us that the purpose of God is not lost. but that indeed there are actually those who are still living and trying to be godly people, living godly lives, shining a light into the lives of other people so that the world can see that there is a God in Israel, and so that the light still shines. Over and over, we see, you hear the saying, there was no king in Israel. When in reality, that wasn't really true, was it? Who was the king of Israel? God was the king of Israel. We are in the very first chapter, the very first verse of the chapter, first chapter of Ruth, introduced to a man by the name, or maybe it's the second verse, a man by the name of Elimelech. Anybody tell me what the Hebrew meaning for the word Elimelech is? I don't think so. My God is king. That's what the definition, that's what the meaning of the word Elimelech is. My God is king. And so it immediately tells us that there is somebody in the nation of Israel who believes that there is a king in Israel and that he is God, that God is king. And we can testify to that all we want to verbally. But until our lives actually testify to that, it really doesn't make a difference. And so we are introduced to a family that even though there are hard times in Israel, and even though they may have made, maybe not necessarily a wise choice of leaving Israel and going to a foreign country because of the famine, some argue that was a bad thing. Some may suggest that was just kind of God's will of just spreading the goodness of God. They move into Moab to find a better life, to find food, to find the ability to survive. And of course, a lot of things happen to them. We'll study those in detail as we go through them. But one of the things that the book of Ruth points to us is that there are some godly people, and that those godly people have godly influence. Because here we have a husband and wife, two sons that travel to Moab, and they get married to women of Moab. And you say, wait a minute, they shouldn't have done that. Well, that depends on whether or not those women converted over to Judaism, wouldn't it? Because if they became Jewish people, then there would be nothing wrong with that. Because they would have, and we see in the wording of Ruth, when after their husbands die, and she says, don't entreat me to leave you and to stop from following after you. Where you go, I'll go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. And then what else did she say? Your people will be my people, and your God is my God. So that tells you real clearly that you can, what would take a person willing to do that, to leave their own country, to leave their own area where they have been born, raised, and are very comfortable with, to travel into a foreign country behind someone who they've only met just a few years back? If it wasn't for the godly influence of that husband and wife, for her to be willing to say, I am willing for your God to be my God. And so even in the midst of all this disaster that we're seeing in Judges, this story takes place during the time of the Judges. And so we're seeing a parallel to this, that not everybody was wicked. There were some people who were actually trying to do the will of God. And I think that's what gives us encouragement in all of this. In addition to Naomi and her husband having a godly influence, we find later on in the book, we're in chapter 2, we're introduced to another guy who is a godly man. His name is Boaz. And in contrast to the communications and the interactions that we see in all the stuff that goes on in Judges, we see this man. He's quite wealthy. Obviously, God is blessing him. He has He has land. He has farmland. He's making money, I guess, doing that kind of stuff. And he's got employees that work with him. And notice the casual conversation when he goes out in the field and starts talking to his employees. Well, anybody recall? I don't know if you read up ahead there. Take a look at verse 4 of chapter 2, where we see him going out in the field, and as he greets his employees, he says, Lord be with you. And they respond to him what? The Lord bless thee. In the workplace, how common is it for us to see people talking about the Lord and being willing to exchange those kind of greetings? In Judges, we would have thought that would never happen, but we're seeing that that's actually a part of their daily life. Not only that, when we trace on through the story and we see the story unfold and how Ruth and Boaz come together to get married, we see that Boaz is an honorable person. He's an honorable person. It is obvious that as the story develops that he has a great affection for Ruth. Some might say he fell in love with her. I don't know. He noticed her long before she approached him to let him know that he was her next of kinsman. Of course, we'll get into the discussion about the law of the kinsman. In her case, her husband had died, leaving no children. But even though he was in love with her, even though when went and talked to the other kinsman that is actually closer to her, and he's kind of glad that he couldn't accept the responsibility, he was still not willing to set aside the rules, the law, because he had to tell her, he said, there's somebody else who's closer kinman than I am. I need to talk with them first, see if they can redeem you. Now, if he was in love with her, he could have said, hey, love is going to win all. We just won't tell the other guy about it. And we're talking about a right of inheritance is what we're really talking about. And here, there was someone else who stood to inherit Ruth before. And I know that kind of sounds kind of strange in our culture, talking about inheriting a woman, but the fact of it is that under those laws, that if someone, a man died leaving no children, then the responsibility was for his nearest kinsman to marry her and bear children in that dead brother's name. And so here he says, I would love to do it. I want to do it. I want to marry you, but I have to be honest with you. There's someone else closer. And it wasn't until he got consent and permission from the nearer kinsman that it was okay, because he could not redeem Ruth. Then he married her. And so we see, there are times when we make decisions in our lives that we may say, well, I'll just overlook this rule here because this is really what I want to do. And so we wind up doing things that would not necessarily be right because we don't want to do what's right, for real. We'll just fudge the area just a little bit. Here is a man of great integrity in which he wanted to do what's right, and he realized that doing what was right is the most important thing. Not only that, this book also is very interesting in that here we're introduced at first to a husband and wife who are of the nation of Israel. Elimelech, Naomi. They travel into Moab and their sons marry this lady named Ruth, who is not a child of Israel. She's a foreigner. And yet she is welcomed into the family of God with open arms. And yet somehow the book is not entitled Elimelech and it's not entitled Naomi. It's entitled Ruth. And I think it's important that if the children of Israel had realized that God was not just interested in the nation of Israel, but that he is interested in all of humanity, that they probably would not have taken on the arrogant attitude of superiority that they developed over the years. See, God is recognizing a woman who's not even of the bloodline of Abraham. But then we're taught in the New Testament that the bloodline is not really the children of Abraham, is it? But it's those who walk in the faith of our father Abraham. And here's another interesting concept that we might want to throw in here. When we look at the last chapter here of the book, it gives us a lineage. Let's turn over there for just a moment. And that's the fourth chapter of the book of Ruth. In the very last few verses, it gives us kind of a lineage. A lot of scholars believe that's kind of really the only purpose for the book of Ruth is to give a lineage, an inheritance line of David. In the last several verses of that, verse starting with verse 18. Now these are the generation of Pharez. The Pharez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram. Ram begat Amminadab. Amminadab begat Nahshon. Nahshon begat Salmon. And Salmon begat Boaz. And Boaz begat Obed. And Obed begat Jesse. And Jesse begat David. And that gives us a lineage, but it really doesn't tell us much if we just look at it by that alone, does it? But if we compile that or put that together with Matthew and the account of Matthew, chapter 1, we would notice that this is a very interesting concept. And where Ruth, and not only Ruth, but another young lady fits into the story. And here we are in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. It says, in the book of the generations of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. And Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Judas and his brothers. And Judas begat Pharez and Zerah of Thamar, and Pharez begat Ezrom. And Ezrom begat Aram. And Aram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Naasson. And Naasson begat Salmon. And Salmon begat Boaz of Rechab. Matthew throws that in. And Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. And Obed begat Jesse. And Jesse begat David, the king. Here we are studying the story of a heathen woman coming into the nation of Israel, marrying a Israelite, one of the members of the family of God, and getting into the lineage of King David. But let me ask you the question, who was her mother-in-law? Who was Ruth's mother-in-law? No, that was her first mother-in-law. Yeah, we're going to the lineage. They'll throw Naomi in there. Who was her other mother-in-law? Rahab the harlot. Notice that there in Matthew chapter 1 there. Verse 5. And Salmon begat Boaz. And the transliteration here into Greek pronounces or spells her as Rechab. Boaz's mother was Rahab the harlot. So here we've got two generations of women who are not Israelites. Rahab was married to Salmon, who Salmon was Boaz's father, which means that was his mother. Maybe this was why Boaz had such a compassion in his heart for a foreign-born woman who was destitute in Israel. Because his mother was a foreign-born woman who had come to Israel. Because if you remember, when Joshua came in there and storming the city of Jericho, who was the person that received the spies and protected them from being killed? It was Rahab. And now she has accepted the God of Israel, has become a part of the nation of Israel, a proselyte, if you would, converting over into Judaism, and has stepped into the lineage of King David, which Matthew shows us is the lineage of royalty. This is where Jesus came from, which tells us very clearly that God has no respect to persons. It doesn't matter where you came from. No matter who you were born to. What Cash was talking about was one of the judges. Doesn't matter how you was born, how you was conceived. No matter what the circumstances were in which God can take you from wherever you are and use you in his scheme of redemption, his plan, regardless of who you are, which tells us that whoever you think you are, it ain't that much, because God don't need you. God works through man, but he doesn't have to work through me. And here, God has in the nation of Israel had developed such, during the time of Jesus and even before, had developed such an arrogance that they thought that they were the reason that Jesus was here. They thought they were the ones that made the whole idea of the Moses law so popular and powerful. But God tells them very clearly, you were nothing when I got you. You were like a kid, a baby, birthed and thrown to the side of the road. You were still, hadn't even been cleaned up. You're a mess. But I found you. And I loved you. And I made you who you are. And had they understood that, they would have been able to shine the light of the God of Israel into a dark and ugly world. But instead, because they couldn't have a king, they just decided, I'm going to live like I want to live. And yet I think it's kind of like when the prophet became discouraged and he said, I'm left alone. They seek my life. There's nobody else. I'm the only one standing up for you, Lord. What was God's response? I can see God now. I said, boy, please. I got 7,000 folks that are doing exactly the same thing you're doing. You ain't that special. And this should tell us that when we wake up one day and see ourselves in a nation living like the land of the judges, where folks are just doing whatever they want to do and sin is rampant and folks don't mind destroying people, killing people, robbing, pilfering, raping, doing whatever they want to do just because that's what they think is right in their own eyes. And we feel like we're the only ones that's trying to do right. God is letting us know there are others that are out there as well. And that he can still work through our lives to shine light into a dark and ugly place. Sometimes we don't necessarily like being in the dark. But your light shines brighter in a dark place. You can take a powerful flashlight. They sell them out there in Home Depot and Lowe's, and you can buy them with 6,000 lumens, 8,000 lumens. You can buy them so bright that if you shine them in your face, you'll see stars for the next 5 minutes. And they don't look that bright in the daytime. They don't look that much at all. But you get them at night, and they'll light up the whole yard. And that's what the Apostle Paul would tell us, that we're like in light shining in a dark world. And we've got to allow the light of Jesus Christ to shine through us. I think that's what the story of Ruth is telling us. Perhaps that is why Boaz had such compassion in his heart toward Ruth, because he knew what it was like to be on the outside, looking in. And that is one of the things that God tells each of us when we see someone else who's struggling in life, and we need to let our light so shine that they'll see our good works, so that we can be there. We can be someone who is compassionate enough to help out, and even if they're in need or overtaken in a fault or whatever it is that their life has brought upon them, that they can truly see the light that we shine. Because just like the children of Israel, the church, its purpose is to let our light so shine so that people will see God in us and want to be a part of the family of God. And that's what this whole story is all about. The fact that we see Ruth taking on a divine role in the royal heritage of Jesus Christ is tremendous. Any questions or comments about our introduction section so far? All right. Well, let's move right along. We'll start attacking our text and start taking a look at what, in the few moments that we have here, we'll take a look at the story as it unfolds. We'll see the first 5 verses. We'll break it up into that, and this gives us the background and the story of what is actually happening here. And it tells us that this is in the days of the judges, so kind of gives us a footprint about where we are in the historical sketch. We'll read these first 5 verses, and then we'll discuss them for a few moments. Now, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon, and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came unto the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. One was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. There's something about the location that they came from that kind of rings a bell, doesn't it? They were Ephrathites. What does it mean? Need some help up off in here. They were from the tribe of Ephraim. What tribe was that did all that wickedness? What tribe was that in Judges that did all that evil? Did it? Okay. Okay. So here we are, but are we not also looking at have we not heard of the Bethlehem, Judah? Wasn't that where the Levite was traveling from? So we're seeing some common storylines. So we're seeing it here where we're being able to connect it to the rest of the story, which we've heard. Is placed it in the time of the judges. They are of the tribe of Ephraim. They are there from Bethlehem, Judah. They are traveling to the country of Moab. Now, this is where, some scholars would say this was a bad choice, that he should not have left the nation of Israel. Maybe not. You know, it was a famine going on, and they needed to find something to eat. Apparently wasn't very much food in Israel. And so we see, if we glance back through history sometime, we'll see that even Jacob did. Where did he go when there was a famine? You might remember where Jacob go when he got into the famine? They sent down to where? Egypt. Okay. Abraham, when things got tough on him, where'd he go? Egypt. Okay, all right. So we find people moving around. Just because they left the country of Israel doesn't mean that he left God. And obviously, as the story unfolds, it's very clear that they took God with them, and that they were spreading the goodness of God wherever they went. Even David, when he was running from Saul, he went into the land of the Philistines at one time and stayed there. In fact, you'll find a story when he was running, he was in the hold a lot with his men. He actually took his mother and father and asked a foreign country to watch over them for him. So I can't really say with any clarity that this was a bad decision on his part. You know, I know that's what Naomi concludes when life hits her as hard as it did. She kind of, oh well, man, I think we shouldn't have left Israel because maybe God's punishing us for this. But how many of us, whenever we do something and it don't turn out like we thought it should have turned out, we come to that conclusion as well. Oh man, I guess I messed up here. Maybe God's trying to tell me I need to do something else. Okay. So whether that was a bad decision or not it's really hard to say. We do know that when they left, they went and lived in a place where they could get something to eat. Now, it could have been a different story had they not carried God with them. You know, Genesis tells us about how Abraham was the kind of person that God could trust because he knew he would command his children after him to know the Lord and respect the Lord and do his will. And obviously Elimelech is doing that very thing. His very name recognizes that my God is king. And so he is obviously has raised his children and led his family to love, honor, and respect the Lord. And we see that as when hard times come along, that even the daughter-in-law decides to stay with God. Now you might say, well, Orpha didn't stay with her. Well, even the New Testament tells us that not everybody gonna stay, is it? you can lead a lot of folks. You can baptize a lot of folks. You can bring people out of sin and into the world of godliness. But not everybody's gonna stay, are they? In fact, if you get 50%, you're really doing that. That's pretty good numbers, actually. So here we are. We see that. See, they've gone there. They've come out of their land. They've gone to the land of Moab. Her husband dies first. She only has her 2 sons left. They get married. They're able to spend about 10 years in this area. And then boys die as well, and she's ready to return back to her hometown. Takes us to our next series of verses. And that's starting with verse 6. And we'll actually break it at verse 14 for the length of the text, so that we can focus a little bit on Ruth's response in contrast to her the other sister, daughter-in-law's response. And then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she heard that in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people, giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. And the Lord grant unto you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, And they lifted up their voice and wept. They said unto her, surely we will return with thee to thy people. And Naomi said, turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, and go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, and if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would you tarry for them until they were grown? Would you stay for them would you stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sake that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave to her. So one of the underlying principles that I think is quite obvious in this discussion is the fact that they understood Mosaic law. And the only way they could have understood that is had it been taught in their family, had it been led by the husband and the mother, the wife. And because here she is discussing something that Moabite girls would never even have any knowledge about, and that is the law of the brother. Jesus touches on this in his earthly ministry. The law was that if a man die having no children, that his nearest of kin, his brother, should marry his widow and have a child. And that first child would be named after the dead man. What was the purpose of that? Anybody can help me with the purpose of that? So that man would not be wiped out from the inheritance of Israel. That his name would go on. And notice, it didn't say that he would marry her and have a child, did it? He would have a son. Because the son would be the only one that would carry the father's name. And if that man married her and had a boy, he could not name him after him. It had to be named after the dead brother so that the inheritance would go on. You remember the story, and this went on even before Israel got started, didn't it? Remember the story of when I was trying to grasp the name, remember the name. When Jacob was journeying in the Middle East, in Palestine, and the old brother got married, and he died. I think it was it Judah? And he gave him his next brother. The next brother didn't want to have children by her, so he would not impregnate her. God killed him for it. And so the father, Judah, said, "My baby boy, you killing all my sons." But that law was in effect, and that was God was conserving a bloodline so that the nation of Israel and that the seed of Abraham could continue to the coming of Christ. And so here, Naomi is discussing this like it's common knowledge. And if it weren't common knowledge, what would the daughters-in-law say? Are you crazy? Why would we be looking for you to get a husband? She's simply telling them, said, y'all need to go on back and marry somebody else because I'm too old to have another child. You know? And if I did have a child, if I had a husband today and got pregnant tonight, would you wait for that boy to grow up and not get married again for the next 20 years or so until he was mature enough to marry him and have a baby by him so you could your dead son, your dead husband would have a seed? No, you wouldn't do that. But here's the thing. Even though Orpah went back to her people, you could tell she didn't really want to. What gives that away? The emotional circumstances where they're tearing this family apart. They've already been through so much together. They've lost husbands, all of them have. They love their mother-in-law. They want to stay with her. In fact, they're leaving Moab. They're heading back to Judah, and the girls are going with her. And the mother, Naomi, is trying to suggest to them that probably what's best for you is to go back to your people and marry somebody. And the very idea of that brings them all to tears. I do not believe you would have that kind of thing had there not been a godly relationship in that family. And I think that's something we have to be able to see in this story because it's obvious that there is a love that is built there. It's only been 10 years or so, but it's been a love there. And that's one of the things that living godly lives creates in between people. You know, when you're out there doing your own thing, man, I'm talking about, you can go on if you want to. Ain't no love lost. But when you build a relationship, and one of the greatest things of having a membership in the Church of Christ is that we have brothers and sisters that we come to know and a bond to, and many times they last us for a lifetime. And through all of our difficulties, our own personal issues that come along, we've got somebody that we can pull on and say, hey, I need some help. I need to talk to somebody. And here is the relationship that we're seeing in this family. And even though she doesn't want to, Orpha decides, you're probably right. If I'm going to get married again and have some children, I'm probably going to need to find somebody here. And even as we see right here in the last verse of this, that the Bible tells us that she kisses her, and as she's crying, verse 14, and they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpha kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. There will be times when our futures may pivot, change, or hang on a single decision that we make. And we're going to we're always going to make the best decision we can think of. I'm sure Orpha thought that this was the best thing that she was going to do. And it would be the best for her future. But there are times when we are more concerned about how we feel about a situation, how it gives us happiness or contentment or satisfaction, rather than us holding ourselves to what would God want me to do. And so the Bible tells us that Ruth clave to her mother-in-law. She wouldn't leave her. Probably in her mind, she's thinking, well, I'm all the family she got. Well, what else? Granted, she's going back to her home, but Ruth would be going to a strange place where she would have no knowledge about who the people were. Only thing that she would know about is what? Their God. Because obviously, that has been something that she has learned about during the 10 years or so that she's lived with Naomi and with her husband. So she makes the decision. And I think that's a pivotal point because the book ain't named Orpha, is it? Named Ruth, isn't it? Because Ruth stuck it out. And there's times when we will make a decision to do what God wants us to do when we're not going to be able to clearly see how that works. It's not going to make sense to us. We have to be guided by the rule and not by our emotions. Guided by what God requires, not by what my heart wants. The world will tell you to follow your heart. God said, don't do that. It's going to mess you up. The world will tell you, do whatever your conscience tells you to do. Let your conscience be your guide. God said, don't do that. Let my word be your guide. And so here we're finding a young lady who has decided, even though she does not have a background in the Mosaic law, she has spent the last 10 years being in a family that respects it. And because of that, she has made a decision to live for God. And we see that in the next few verses, which we'll pick up on Sunday morning. Any questions or comments as we end this evening? Thank you very much for your time and your attention.